Hello friends, welcome to the HFY Ode, where we bring you new science fiction stories, a new world, a new adventure. And yes, there is no robotic or AI voices here, only real human voices with real human touch. So let's start this journey, and please subscribe my channel if you like the stories and press the bell icon for the latest updates.
I have cataloged 11,412 hours of combat footage across 6 active war theaters. I have watched species twice our size fold under pressure. I have watched empires negotiate surrender before the first volley finished cooling. I have filed reports on beings who could level cities with their biology alone, and who still, ultimately, chose survival over the fight. I thought I understood war. Then Command dropped a single human into our operation and told me to observe. Not lead, not advise. Observe. I want you to understand what that word cost me. An officer of 12 years, decorated twice, pulling observation duty on a mammal from a wet rock of a planet that has been spacefaring for less time than my species has had indoor plumbing. I filed 3 formal objections. I was denied 3 times. So I watched. And somewhere between the 3rd hour and the moment he went to one knee in the mud and looked up at me like he was making a decision that would cost him something, I stopped filing objections. I started filing something else entirely. This is that report. The coffee was terrible. I want that on record. Not because it matters strategically, it doesn't, but because I have logged 41 consecutive cycles aboard Murath Station, and every single one of them has begun with a mug of something the station's fabricator insists is Terran blend, dark roast, and every single one of those mugs has tasted like someone boiled an old boot in brackish water and then apologized for it afterward. I note this because the human, designation, Sergeant Eli Voss, Terran Coalition Forward Operations, the loan attached to our unit for what Command euphemistically called a joint capability assessment, drank 4 of those mugs before his first briefing ended. 4, without flinching. I filed a minor addendum to my intake report. Subject displays probable neurological damage or exceptional sensory suppression. Recommend medical screening. Command did not respond, which is its own kind of response. We were 3 days into the Murath containment when they assigned Voss to us. And the situation was this. A collective splinter cell had dug into the lower processing district, an absolute maze of compressed ore corridors and reclaimed pipe infrastructure that our tactical maps had given up accurately rendering about 4 months prior. We had 200 meters of verified entry points. We had, our analysts believed, somewhere between 40 and 70 collective fighters using those corridors like a second skeleton. We had lost 2 full scout teams trying to confirm the number. 12 soldiers. Command's answer to this was 1 human. I sat in on the assignment briefing. Major Thren, our commanding officer, a Veldari female who communicated displeasure through increasingly tight facial musculature, explained the mission parameters to Voss with the kind of clipped efficiency you use when you don't actually expect results. Go in. Confirm troop positions. Exit. Do not engage unless unavoidable. And Voss listened. He had a pen. He kept clicking it. A small silver thing, retractable, the kind with a spring mechanism. And every time Thren paused, the pen clicked. Not nervously. Not fidgeting, exactly. More like punctuation. Like he was editing her briefing in real time. Click. 40 to 70. That range concern you? He asked. Thren's facial muscles tightened. We are working with incomplete data. Click. Uh-huh. He looked at the map. What were the scout teams carrying? Standard reconnaissance load. Passive sensors. Minimal arms. Click. What did the collective take off them? The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when someone has asked a question nobody wanted asked. Thren's aide looked at his tablet. Thren looked at the wall. I looked at Voss. He was still looking at the map. The sensors, I said. He nodded once. Didn't look at me. So now they know what we're looking for and how we're looking for it. He folded his copy of the map into quarters without ceremony and tucked it somewhere inside his vest. Okay, when do I go? I was told to shadow him from the monitoring station. Remote feeds, positional tracker, audio relay. I was not told why I specifically was being asked to monitor rather than any of the dozen other analysts on staff, a question I asked twice and received non-answers to both times, which meant either command had a reason they weren't sharing, or someone above me had a very specific idea of what they wanted documented and wanted someone thorough doing the documenting. I am irritatingly very thorough. I poured my fifth terrible coffee of the morning and opened the monitoring console at 4:02. Voss's tracker showed him already at entry point 7, not the one Thren had designated as primary approach. I flagged it. Received no response from command. They logged the deviation at 4:04. His audio feed was live. For the first 11 minutes, he said nothing. The feed gave me sound instead. The grind of his boots on compressed ore, the distant drip of coolant from ruptured overhead pipe, his breathing, measured, unhurried in a way that felt almost calculated, like he was pacing it, like breath was a resource he was consciously managing. At 4:16, he stopped moving. I watched his position marker hold completely still for 4 minutes and 23 seconds. I'm going to be honest. I checked the feed twice for malfunction. He was crouched in a junction corridor 3 meters from what our dead map suggested was a collapsed access point. He wasn't moving. He wasn't transmitting. He was, as far as I could determine from audio, listening to the sound the pipes made. At 4:20, he moved right, away from the collapsed point. Into a secondary corridor our maps didn't have on record at all. I started a new log file. 4:31. He found the first of them 11 minutes in. Not through sensors, not through any equipment I could identify on his loadout. He rounded a corner in the dark. I was watching through a secondary microcam he'd clipped to his shoulder on the way in, its footage grainy and half useless. And he stopped with the particular stillness of something that has just detected something else. 3 seconds. And then he backed up slowly and took a different route. I cross-referenced his new path against the map. He was going around, not retreating, circumnavigating. I pulled up the audio from that corridor segment and ran an enhancement pass. There, barely there, a sound. 2 sounds, actually. The low mechanical hum of a collective portable relay beacon and, underneath it, the specific syncopated rhythm of 2 beings breathing at different rates in the same enclosed space. He'd heard that. Me in a corridor full of pipe noise and structural groan, he had heard 2 enemy soldiers breathing and adjusted his route before I'd even processed the audio. I wrote, "Subject auditory processing, flag for assessment." Then I crossed it out. It felt reductive. 5:14. He had mapped, by my count, 6 confirmed collective positions. He'd done it without triggering a single sensor, not because he'd disabled them, but because he kept finding routes between them. Like he was reading the negative space, the gaps in the pattern, going where the sensors weren't pointed because he'd figured out where they were pointed from context alone. I had stopped drinking my coffee. I hadn't noticed until I went to take a sip and found it had gone fully cold. At 5:17, he stopped again, longer this time. And his position marker sat in a corridor junction for 6 full minutes while I watched his audio levels fluctuate with the particular texture of someone who is doing a great deal of thinking in a very small space. Then he transmitted, "Osin." I sat up straight. He had never addressed me by name. "Go ahead." 73. A pause. Not 40 to 70. 73, 2 command positions, 1 here. A scrape of something. Maybe his finger on the map he'd folded into his vest. And 1 further east, closer to the old water processing unit. The eastern one's mobile, rotates on a 6-minute cycle. I was already typing. How certain? The relay beacons are running a sync pattern. You can see it in the power fluctuations on your feed if you pull the baseline from... Actually, you know what? I'll explain it later. The relevant thing is, they've been here longer than 6 days and they've run a supply line through the northeast sluice conduit. Another pause. Which your last two teams probably walked directly past on their way to the sensor fields. I stopped typing. Sergeant. Yeah. You're describing a fortified position with 73 combatants using a rotating mobile command structure. Yep. The mission brief said observe and exit. A very long pause. It did, he said. Yo, and? The pen clicked. I heard it through the audio feed. He'd been clicking it this whole time, I realized, the entire time he was moving, this tiny metronomic sound I'd been processing as ambient noise. And I want to ask you something, he said, off the record. I looked at my logging console, which was, at that moment, logging everything. All right, I said. Is Command going to act on this intel in the next 6 hours? Or are they going to spend 4 of those hours in confirmation meetings and miss the window when the mobile command post loops back to its closest point to Entry 7? I knew the answer. He knew I knew. Give me a minute, he said. Sergeant? But his position marker had already started moving, deeper in. I poured a fresh mug of terrible coffee and opened a secondary log labeled Addendum, unsanctioned activity. It was going to be a long cycle. I should have pulled him out. And I want that on record, too. Not as a defense. I'm past the point where this report functions as a defense, but because accuracy matters, and the accurate thing is that I had 3 separate moments between 5:34 and 5:58 where I had the authority to transmit an abort signal, and I did not use it. The first time I told myself I was gathering data. The second time, I told myself he was still within recoverable range. The third time, he'd already done it. Yeah, and the moment for pulling him had passed the way moments do. Quietly, without announcement, and then irreversibly. What he did, in the most stripped-down operational terms, was this. He moved to the northeast sluice conduit. He did not go in. He went above it, through a crawl maintenance corridor that should not, according to any map we had, have connected to the conduit junction. And I watched his tracker take a path that our cartography literally did not account for, and arrived at the only reasonable conclusion. He'd found infrastructure that predated our maps by at least a decade, and had been following it from the moment he entered Entry 7. Not Entry 7 because it was close to the target zone. Entry 7 because it was close to an access hatch for a pipe network that post-dated our intelligence files. He'd done the research before the briefing ended, and I sat with that for a moment. Then his audio feed gave me a new sound. The low, pressurized hiss of something venting from the conduit below, and Voss's breathing shifting from measured to the specific pattern of someone who is choosing to do a thing they know is expensive. 5:58. The conduit junction connected to the collective's primary supply line, which connected, as he'd mapped, to both command positions. He didn't attack the supply line. He contaminated it. And I watched his tracker hold still for 4 minutes while he worked, and the audio gave me nothing useful except small sounds. The snick of something being opened, a low chemical smell that apparently carried well enough for his mic to register it. I know because he muttered, "God, that smells awful," and then went back to working. And finally, a soft, deliberate hiss as whatever he'd introduced to the line began moving through the system. Non-lethal. I confirmed that later. So a disruption compound, an old Terran coalition formula designed to corrupt collective relay synchronization. It wouldn't kill anyone. It would, however, convince every relay beacon in that district that it was running 6 minutes behind itself. The rotating mobile command post, the one on a 6-minute cycle. He had just made it stationary. 6:21. He was extracting. I know this because his tracker was moving back toward Entry 7 at a pace that, if I am being fully honest, it looked leisurely from the outside, which probably means it was anything but from the inside. He'd made it to the junction corridor, the one where he'd first heard the 2 collective soldiers breathing, what felt like years ago. When the tracker stopped, my console flagged it. Position anomaly. Subject stationary. I pulled up his shoulder cam feed. 2 collective soldiers, not the ones from before. The relay scramble had sent 4 separate patrols into low-signal loops. And these 2 were walking one of those loops directly through the junction corridor at exactly the wrong moment, or exactly the right moment, depending on your framing. Voss was pressed into an alcove 3 meters back. I could see the edge of his shoulder, the side of his face, just barely in the cam's limited field. He wasn't moving. He was watching them move, and from the angle of his head, I could tell he was doing the same thing he'd been doing since the moment he entered. Counting. Calculating. Reading the space between things. The soldiers passed. He didn't move for another 90 seconds. Then he pulled out his pen and clicked it once. I don't know why that detail lodged in my chest the way it did. It shouldn't have. It was a pen. But the click felt like a sentence being completed, like whatever math he'd been doing had just produced an answer. And then he was moving again, smooth and unhurried. I toward entry 7 and the gray pre-dawn light coming through the access grate. 6:44. He came out covered in conduit residue, which apparently smelled worse from the outside. I know because I met him at the station threshold. Something I had not planned to do, something that was not part of my assigned monitoring role, something I did anyway. And the first thing he said to me was, "Sorry about the smell." "The relay scramble will hold for how long?" I asked. 18 hours, maybe 20. It depends on how fast their tech team diagnoses it. He pulled the folded map from his vest and handed it to me. It was covered in small, precise notations in Terran script, position markers, timing notes, a series of numbers I didn't fully parse until later, when I realized they were acoustic readings, sound signatures he'd memorized and cross-referenced against collective standard equipment profiles to identify what was where before he'd ever visually confirmed it. He'd been doing that in his head, the entire time. I looked at the map. I looked at him. He looked like a man who had run a very long way and was pretending not to be tired, which is a specific expression I had never encountered before on any face I'd cataloged, and I have been cataloging faces professionally for 12 years. "Command is going to want a debrief," I said. I know. They're also going to want an explanation for why you deviated from the sanctioned mission parameters. I know that too. Sergeant Voss. I stopped. I was not sure, precisely, what I had been about to say. I know what I had been feeling. Something uncomfortable in the region of my secondary cardiac valve, which my personal physician has repeatedly told me is where I physically store career anxiety. What you just did in there, the relay disruption, the acoustic mapping, and the unsanctioned extension of the operation, that is not something I can simply not include in my report. He looked at me. "I'm not asking you to," he said. "You knew I'd have to report it?" "Yes." "And you did it anyway." He looked out at the station, at the compressed ore walls and the bad lighting and the fabricator alcove that made the terrible coffee. He was quiet for long enough that I started composing my next question. Then he said, "The window was 6 hours. Command was going to spend 4 of them confirming what I already confirmed. 2 of your soldiers died getting intel that was already 6 days stale by the time it reached analysis." He looked back at me. I wasn't going to let the next window close while we were running confirmation meetings. "That's not your call to make." "No," he agreed. "It's not." A beat. "But you didn't pull me," he said. I did not have an answer for that. I still don't have a clean one. I had 3 opportunities to abort his operation, and I watched all 3 of them pass. What I had, instead of an answer, was the beginning of a different kind of understanding, the kind that forms slowly, uncomfortably, like a secondary fracture you don't notice until you try to put weight on it. He'd known I wouldn't pull him, not because he'd manipulated me, not because he'd calculated my response time and found a gap he could exploit. And he'd known because he'd read something in the way I'd answered his question earlier. Is Command going to act on this intel? And what he'd read was not my rank or my function or my professional obligation. He'd read that I was the kind of officer who would not let a window close if there was still something that could be done about it. He'd been right. 7:02. He went to one knee in the mud outside the entry threshold. Not dramatics, not ceremony. And there was a piece of the conduit residue on his boot that was bothering him, and he was scraping it off with a piece of broken grate, and that put him on one knee in the mud, and he looked up at me from there with that same expression, the one that looked like an offer, or a question, or both. "They're going to pull my attachment after the debrief," he said. "Command doesn't like independent action. It makes the reports complicated." "It does," I agreed, "if it comes to that." He stood. I want you to know I wasn't operating against your unit's interests in there. I was operating toward them. There's a difference." He held out the map again. He'd been holding it the whole time, and this time I took it. "Everything I found is on there. The notation key is in the top right corner. It'll make sense." It did make sense. Later, after the debrief, or after Command's controlled fury over the deviated parameters settled into the grudging arithmetic of results, 73 confirmed positions, mobile command neutralized for 20 hours, supply line disrupted, 0 casualties, it made complete sense. But standing there in the gray light with the residue-soaked map in my hands, what I was doing was not analysis. I was trying to figure out when, exactly, I had stopped observing and started trusting. 7:09, final entry, per cycle 8.441. Command accepted the debrief. They filed 2 formal objections to Voss's methodology and then immediately requested his reassignment to the Murath operation for the following cycle. I filed 1 formal objection to being assigned monitoring duty on a second consecutive joint operation. I was denied. I am currently on my 6th cup of terrible coffee. Voss, who I passed in the corridor 10 minutes ago, told me I should try it with water from the secondary fabricator rather than the primary, because the primary has a calcium buildup in the heating coil that's been affecting the taste. I looked at him. "You've been here 3 days," I said. "I noticed the taste difference on the first morning," he said, and kept walking. I stood in that corridor for a long time. Then I went back to my console, opened a new log file, and wrote at the top of it, Cycle 8.442, subject, continued observation. I didn't cross it out this time.